Good afternoon. I'm Francesca Nestor, Assistant Professor in Politics and Government. I am co-director of the COVID-19 course along with Dr. Kira Bailey in Psychology and Neuroscience. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone back for the 9th lecture in our series. Today we will learn from Dr. Anne Sokolsky. Dr. Anne Sokolsky received her PhD in Modern Japanese Literature with a subspecialty in Gender Studies from the University of California, Berkeley in 2003. Her book, From New Woman Writer to Socialist, The Life and Selected Writings of Tamura Toshiko from 1936 to 1938, is about one of Japan's early modern feminist writers who spent 2 decades living in North America in the 1920s and 1930s. Sokolsky's research on Tamura, as well as on colonial Taiwanese literature written in Japanese, has appeared in scholarly journals published in the United States and Japan. Dr. Sokolsky is currently the literature editor of the Journal of Japanese Language and Literature, and her current research is on how the Tokyo trial, which lasted from 1946 to 1948, is depicted in literature and film. Dr. Sokolsky is also working on a biography of her grandfather, who was a journalist in Shanghai in the early part of the 20th century. Dr. Sokolsky was a Fulbright Scholar in Japan from 2001 to 2002. In addition to living in Japan for 8 years, she spent 2 years in Morocco, where she was a Peace Corps volunteer. While in Morocco, she learned Moroccan Arabic and then continued studying Arabic at Harvard University, where she received an MEd in International Education and Development. At Ohio Wesleyan, she is a faculty member of the East Asian Studies program and the Women and Gender Studies program, and chair of the Department of Comparative Literature. Dr. Sokolsky was just promoted to the status of full professor. As a reminder, you can use the chat function to ask questions throughout the presentation. Dr. Sokolsky will speak for about 50 minutes, and then we will open up for questions. You can also continue your discussions on the COVID-19 course Facebook group. And now, literary responses to past pandemics with Dr. Anne Sokolsky.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesca. Probably like many of you, prior to COVID-19, I had not given much thought to pandemics, and certainly not the idea of pandemic literature. When my colleagues began to brainstorm about organizing an interdisciplinary course about our responses to COVID-19 through our different fields of specialty, I started doing some research, like all academics do when there's a question. When I Googled on pandemic literature, much to my surprise, I found quite a bit of information. And each day I would say I find more information. So the first 2 articles I assigned for the class readings for the students who are registered for the course, who are taking it for credit. One is about Western literature, and I'll be referencing that a lot today in today's lecture. The other one is about Japanese yokai, and I have decided to save that discussion. It's from the New Yorker article I assigned. I've decided to save that discussion for the Meet the Professor. And so I'll have a supplementary lecture, very brief, not as long as today's lecture, about yokai. But I do want to give a nod to that assignment. So that's why you see this picture on the intro screen. And there is a bit of a connection with today's theme. Today's theme, I'm focusing on text and literary responses through the format of a text. But the discussion of Japanese yokai, specifically the amabie, gets into cultural responses to COVID-19. And just very briefly, in the New Yorker article, they explain what yokai are. Yokai are, they come from Japanese folklore. They are the spirits, the demons, the monsters. They can be good, they can be bad. You probably have eaten a yokai if you've gone and ordered sushi and had cucumber sushi, because that comes from, in Japanese, it's known as kappamaki, and kappa is one of these yokai, and the kappa likes cucumbers. But this picture is of amabie, and this is a forgotten yokai who has resurfaced as a result of COVID-19. And this image that I'm showing you right now, in my research, every day I find new articles, and there's been this huge social media spread of the image of this amabie, who is supposed to be the yokai who protects people from any kind of sort of virus, any kind of pestilence. And so now people are tweeting this and have it as their iPhone wallpaper. So anyhow, as I said, I'll talk more about this in our discussion group, but I did want to give a nod to yokai since my specialty is Japanese literature. So anyhow, this next photo, there's a cameo appearance of my dog Chester, who's out in the yard right now in the heat, and I'm hoping that he doesn't bark during my lecture. And hopefully I can ignore him. But this is where I have been, not today. Today is sweltering hot, but on days where the weather is nice and it is not hot or raining, I am trying to spend as much time as I can outdoors and sitting in the swing and reading. And so I've been thinking about the act of reading and what reading has come to mean for me as a literature professor. You can see I have a 6-foot fence, so I'm in a very enclosed space. And my original plan this summer was to actually go to Japan. I had a grant to go to Japan to do research on a project I'm working on the Tokyo trials, and the books behind me, there's a big box over there. That was the research I was supposed to be doing this summer. I was also thinking about going to Poland to do some research on my grandfather. And just a shout out to my grandfather, who's no longer alive. These scrolls in the background are from his life when he lived in Shanghai. So that was what my summer was supposed to be. And obviously that isn't going to happen. It's just like for all of us, our summer plans have changed. So I'm spending a lot of time either in this room where I have conducted all my classes since March, doing my research, or out in the yard with my dog in that swing, reading. So reading for me, especially during this lockdown, has been about answering the questions about why we're in this situation, as I've been doing research for this lecture. And also as a source of solace. Obviously, I love traveling and I can't do that. And so I have spent a lot of time reading the literature of travel, of other people's travels, while I sit in that swing trapped in my yard. So the question I want to ask, especially of the students who will be responding, but anyone who comes to the discussions later, is question 1, have you read any literature during our lockdown? If so, what kind? And what role in general has reading served in your life in the past? And what role does it play now during this historic moment that we are all going through? So just keep those questions in mind. I'm beginning my lecture about the act of reading. I'm going to end my lecture with the act of writing. And obviously, we can't read if no one writes. And I, as a literature professor, spend a great deal of my time reading, reading with my students, normally in a classroom in a seminar with books in front of us. But I also spend a great deal of time writing. And so there's a relationship between these two acts. And what do these two acts mean for people like us who are not particularly famous, or who I was listening to Karen Perensky and Randy Quay's discussions, the issue of statistics versus actual human beings and individuals. So in my process of doing research, one of the first articles I came across is this one, and I'd like you to look at the dates. You'll see this conversation, this discourse that's occurring in the world of literature, literary scholarship. This is by a PhD student in England who posted this, I guess, more of a blog titled Pandemics from Homer to Stephen King, What We Can Learn from Literary History. And as you'll see, the list is quite interesting. It begins with Homer's The Iliad and ends with a Chinese-American writer Ling Ma's work Severance, which is sort of this post-apocalyptic zombie-like novel. Chelsea Hayth goes through each of these works and gives a brief plot summary as sort of suggested readings for all of, for her readers to read during this pandemic. So I have this list here for your FYI. I am not going to go through all of these works. I'm going to discuss some other ones, but this is just more for your FYI to consider in the process of reading during our lockdown. Another essay that I found by Mary Beard, who is at Cambridge University and is a classicist there and writes a column called A Don's Life, is she talks about the Iliad, the first pandemic in Western literature. So I want us to think about that. Western literature began with, to quote Mary Beard, infection. And that capitalization is in her essay. That's not me, that's her emphasis. So for all of us who want to remember our high school years where we probably read the Iliad and the Odyssey, I just want to bring us back to the beginnings of Western literature. And this is a recent translation by Caroline Alexander in 2015. It got very good reviews. I bought the book. I plan to reread the Iliad during this lockdown. But it's interesting to think that Western literature began with the word wrath. And so this is the opening wrath, sing goddess of the ruinous wrath of Peleus' son Achilles that inflicted woes without number upon the Achaeans. And the scene, the opening scene of the Iliad is basically the wrath of the god Apollo, who is furious, and I'll go back to this picture, who is furious with Agamemnon for the way he has captured a high priest's daughter and has turned her into a sex slave and refuses to give her back. So what do Greek gods do when they're angry? They send a plague onto the people. So that's the beginning of Western literature. Now I want to get the first essay that I assigned, and I'll be referencing this essay quite a bit in today's lecture, How Pandemics Seep into Literature. This is by Elizabeth Oatka, and it appeared in the Paris Review, and you see this appeared a month later from the other article that I discussed in previous slides. The picture on the right is a book that she wrote, Viral Modernism, the Influenza Pandemic in Interwar Literature. It came out in 2019, and it is back ordered. I do not own a copy. I ordered it through Columbia University Press, and I'm waiting for it. So as you can see already in my lecture, and this is going to be the case with all the works I discussed today, there's been this resurgence, an interest in works that might have sat on bookshelves and no one perhaps would have read them. But now I cannot get Viral Modernism because everyone is reading books like this today. So her Paris Review article that was published in April draws from her research that she conducted in 2019. And she focuses on two works. I would say that a good portion of the essay is on these two works. William Maxwell's They Came Like Swallows, Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider. And if we were in a class, in a seminar class right now where I could see all of you, I would be asking you, raise your hand. How many of you have heard of these authors? How many of you have read these two works? And these are the two works I'm going to be focusing on today. Catherine Ann Porter I had heard of. William Maxwell I had never heard of before. And I'm pretty sure Pale Horse, Pale Rider, I might have heard the title, but it's because of what we are in today, this pandemic. This is what forced me to sit in my swing when the weather was a tad bit nicer and read these two works. And it was a very interesting experience to sit in this red swing of mine at the back of my yard and read these works about a pandemic as I'm here trapped, in my house to some degree. Other works that Elizabeth Oatka discusses in this essay include two by Virginia Woolf, Yeats's famous poem, The Second Coming, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, and T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. And all of these writers experienced the 1918 pandemic. And I'm very glad, I watched Ellen Arnold's lecture, and I'm very glad she didn't talk about the 1918 pandemic, because that's what I'm going to be talking about for this entire lecture. So anyhow, this is just a, an FYI reading list for all of you. I'm not going to click on this website because I got a warning that it might be insecure and I don't want to lose everyone. But if you do go to this website, Pandemic Literature Meta List of the books you should read in coronavirus quarantine, there are, I think I counted 50 works of fiction and about 15 works of nonfiction. So I would recommend that you go to this website if you can find it. It's in my bibliography. My bibliography includes everything I've read for this lecture. And it's a really interesting reading list that captures works of literature, not just from the United States and England, but Camus' The Plague, as well as other works. So for today, I'm going to focus on 3 works. William Maxwell's They Came Like Swallows, Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider, and then this strange photo here of a work that I don't know if there's anyone out there in the audience who can read Japanese, but this is a photo I took of this manuscript, and it's from Japan. It's held at the National Diet Library in Japan, where in fact I was planning to go this summer had I been able to travel. And I'm very grateful for the fact that it's in public domain now, and I just downloaded it onto my computer, and in fact right before this lecture I was reading it. Believe it or not, I think there's a relationship. I think there are some commonalities of these 3 works. The first 2 are probably pretty obvious. They are both written by American writers, one male, one female, and they are both written in the 30s. They Came Like Swallows in 1937, Pale Horse, Pale Rider in 1939. So for the first part of the lecture, I'm going to talk a great deal about their commonalities and then bring in this work on the other side. So this work here, that's hard to see, the cover, the photo quality is a little bit difficult to see. It is a 26-page medical diary by a Japanese doctor who lived in the countryside in Japan during the 1918 pandemic. So that's what all of these 3 works have in common. They are all writers' reactions to their experiences with the 1918 influenza pandemic. So the title in English translation is Personal Account of the World Influenza Epidemic of 1918-1919, and the doctor's name is Dr. Gomibuchi Ichiro. So yes, so this photo here is a photo from, I'm sure we're now all seeing lots of imagery of the 1918 pandemic, and I'll talk a little bit later about why it was the forgotten pandemic. But as I said, this is the common point of all 3 of these works. But before I get into these 3 works, I want to take a step back and actually pay homage to a colleague of mine. Any of you who are out there in the OWU community know about the terrible loss my department had, losing my colleague, Sally Livingston. And so up here I have the cover of her book titled Marriage, Property, and Women's Narratives that she published in 2012. And she was a medieval scholar, and she was very interested in women, women's narratives in economics. And so in her introduction, she talks about what she sees as the purpose of literature. And she argues that literature has 2 functions, a future and a past. So she writes, literary texts can anticipate, can tell us what some people in specific intellectual communities are thinking and feeling long before we see change in tangible ways. But she says, and this is a picture of her, she says that literature also records the past. Literature serves as registers of memory, holding in place that which is no longer so in actuality. Literature gives a power over the past and consequently over the present. And so I wanted us to think about the role of literature as both a repository of the past, which these three works that I'm going to discuss obviously are, but I'm also going to be talking about ways in which these three works have spoken to me, and therefore obviously have a connection with our present as we deal with COVID-19, and perhaps can tell us something about our future with COVID-19, the ending of which all of us do not know what the ending is. These writers who wrote about the 1918 influenza pandemic obviously were writing from a point of view much later, after it was over. So for the questions for today's lecture, what do the three texts I will discuss have, oops, I'm sorry, I don't think you can see everything, so I'll read it. What do the three texts I will discuss have in common in terms of how the authors capture the experience of living through the 1918 influenza pandemic, otherwise known as the Spanish flu? So I'm going to argue that the similar patterns I see in all three works, two American from the 1930s and one Japanese from 1919, is that the flu is a character, is a protagonist, even in the nonfiction medical diary of Dr. Gomibuchi. The flu is first viewed as something distant, elsewhere in another part of the world. It is foreign, but then slowly the flu gets closer. It invades first the community and then the bodies of the characters in the two works of fiction, and actually also in the bodies of two of the authors, certainly the bodies of family members. So to write these stories, whether fiction or nonfiction, the authors are obviously survivors. And the first 3 points I would say we are going through right now, right? If you think about when we first heard about COVID-19, it was distant, it was in China, the imagery was coming from a foreign country. We were all making plans for this summer. We had probably very few of us thought that we would be living the way we're living today. And then slowly it started creeping in. And I can vividly remember when I was reading the news that it had entered the United States on the West Coast. I was actually traveling in DC at the time for a conference. And then by the time I get home, I get a call from my parents who are in New York City telling me that it is the bad news about New York City that became the epicenter of it. So, and one of my neighbors who might be actually listening right now said to me that she never thought it was going to come to us, to our community here in Delaware, Ohio. So that invasion of the flu I see in all three works, that slow creep from a distant foreign place to something in our own communities, in our bodies. The part that we have yet to deal with is the conclusion, right? We're still in the midst of the narrative. We are not at the luxury of seeing all of this from some distant perspective as a past tense. We're still in the present tense. But I want you to think about that. What does it mean to survive something so dreadful and I can't see, to come so close to death? How does each author deal with this challenge in their text and also in their act of writing? And then by the end of my lecture, I'll ask us to think about the act of writing for ourselves. So before I get into all of this, I want to give you a brief history of the 1918 influenza pandemic, since my colleague Ellen Arnold wasn't able to cover it. She covered many other pandemics. Sadly, there were a lot of them, and sadly, there will be more in the future. So the Spanish influenza pandemic, this is from an article I read about Dr. Gomi Bucci's medical journal. The authors are Palmer and Rice. They write, the Spanish influenza pandemic ranks alongside the Black Death of the 14th century as one of the worst disease-related disasters of recorded history. How many people actually died? Well, that varies depending on what source I read. I have read in some sources 25 million, 70 million. I noticed in a quote that you'll see later in my PowerPoint of Elizabeth Otka, she says 100 million. So one of the reasons the numbers can range so from 25 to 70 million is that obviously record keeping was not as good as it is today. And there's another reason, but I'll get to that in just a bit. It is estimated that about 500 million people were infected by it, which at the time was apparently a third of the world's population. What was unique about the 1918 influenza pandemic was that it killed healthy young adults. So, the mortality was high in people younger than 5 years old, people 20 to 40 years old, and people 65 and older. The high mortality rate of people between 20 to 40 was a unique aspect of this pandemic. There were more deaths due to the influenza pandemic than due to the war. The properties that made it so devastating are still not well understood. But because there was no vaccine or antibiotics to treat the secondary bacterial infections, people had to do what we're doing today. They had to self-isolate, quarantine, practice good personal hygiene, use disinfectants, and limit public interaction and gatherings, which were applied unevenly back then the way they are today. There is also a shortage of medical personnel in the United States because many doctors and nurses were serving in the war. And probably people know that President Wilson contracted it and during the Treaty of Versailles. Another issue with the pandemic was initially reaction wasn't fast enough. Sound familiar? It's similar to what happened for all of us. The reason, though, for the 1918 influenza pandemic, the reason the reaction was not fast enough was there was competition. There was a war going on, a world war. Also, initially, people assumed it was just another flu. Elizabeth Oka writes in her essay about the 1918 pandemic, it was the second mass death event in 5 years. The pandemic arrived when the world was already overrun with corpses and grief. Another thing about the pandemic is that there is nothing Spanish about it's also referred to as the Spanish flu. It did not originate in Spain. No one knows for sure where it did originate. The first case in the US was at a military base in Kansas on March 11, 1918. The reason that it is called the Spanish flu, and you'll notice I've been trying to avoid calling it the Spanish flu. I've been trying to call it the 1918 influenza pandemic, which seems to be the more official title these days. But the reason it was called the Spanish flu at the time was that Spain was a neutral country. So unlike the belligerent countries that were fighting in the war, Spain did not have a heavy hand of news censorship. Sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. So when the flu reached Spain and reached Madrid, Spain, where the King of Spain died from the flu, that news got out because there was no censorship. And therefore, people jumped to conclusions that Spain was the source of the flu. Interestingly enough, in one source I read, the Spanish referred to it as the French flu, believing that the source came from France. So then in terms of waves, the first wave was rather mild. Most countries of the world experienced some form of the influenza, but more as a flu. It's the second wave that was the most severe. This is where you had the high global mortality rate. And this is when it spread rapidly in the last months of 1918. The third wave was just a few countries, including Japan, and the work that I'm going to discuss today, he is conducting his experiments basically in the third wave. So in Asia, the worst cases in Asia were India. India was hit particularly hard. Japan, in comparison to the other Asian countries, had a slightly lower death rate. The reasoning is still not quite, why that's the case is not quite confirmed. So why is it the forgotten pandemic? This is something that came up in Ellen Arnold's Q&A. Actually, for those of us who live here in the Columbus, Ohio area, we probably all know All Sides with Ann Fisher. She just had a special, she's having a lot of podcasts about COVID-19, but the one I just listened to last week, which was really interesting, was an interview with Frank Snowden, the author of Epidemics and Society, From the Black Death to the Present. And during her interview with Frank Snowden, she brought up, she said, probably now we know about the 1918 the Spanish flu, because if we're Downton Abbey fans, this comes up in Downton Abbey, and I must be honest, I think that was my first introduction to it. Certainly that's the one that registered in my mind as I started doing all this research, was the image of, I'm blanking on her name now, but the wife who gets the flu and almost dies. So there are a couple of reasons why it's been the forgotten pandemic. And Frank Snowden, I actually have a cover of the book America's Forgotten Pandemic, written by Alfred Crosby, because Frank Snowden refers to this in his interview with Ann Fisher. And he says that the bubonic plague lasted years, whereas the 1918 influenza passed through communities in a matter of months. It was devastating when it passed through a community, but it went through rather quickly. There were also competing political events. You have the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, you have World War I, and then you have the 1919 Versailles Treaty. So people were busy, focused on some very significant political events that were reshaping our entire globe. The other issue is what I just mentioned, why it's called the Spanish flu, the issue of censorship. So most countries had a heavy hand of censorship, and no belligerent country wanted news about the flu in their country to get out, because they didn't want to show their vulnerability to their enemy. So as a result, people were not well informed of what was really going on. So now I want to get to the actual stories. The first one is They Came Like Swallows, which, as I said, I had never heard of William Maxwell before, and I'm really embarrassed that I haven't, because he's quite the literary powerhouse. I had never heard of They Came Like Swallows, but in almost all the articles that I looked up on the internet, any kind of reading list of works to read, They Came Like Swallows, Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider are almost always mentioned in all the lists that I found. So as you can see, he was an editor for the New Yorker magazine. He grew up in Lincoln, Illinois, which is described as a picture-perfect Midwestern town, very much like the picture-perfect Midwestern town of Delaware, Ohio. In the New York Times obituary of Maxwell, they described Lincoln as follows: a postcard Midwestern town with tree-shaded streets and a courthouse square where an annual carnival was held and people paraded on patriotic holidays. This certainly sounds like Delaware, Ohio, the community here where I live. In terms of his experience, it's his mother who died of the flu, and this apparently was a shattering event for him, and this plays out in this work, They Came Like Swallows. So briefly, the plot of They Came Like Swallows, it's a detailed portrait of a Midwestern American family named Morrison, who live in the town of Logan, Illinois, which is based on Lincoln, Illinois, and the year is 1918. The youngest son, father, and mother all get the flu, 2 survive and 1 dies. I think the novel is about survival. How does a family remake itself when a pillar of the family, a foundational pillar of the family dies, in this case, the mother? The structure of the novel is in 3 chapters. It begins chapter 1 from the perspective of the youngest son, Bunny, who is very close to his mother, who is actually, the mother is also pregnant, and Bunny is not happy about this. Chapter 2 is told through the story of Bunny's elder brother, Robert. And then chapter 3 is told through the lens of the father dealing with the grief of losing his wife. The first chapter details the life of the family in great detail on what begins as a peaceful second Sunday in November. Now to Pale Horse Pale Rider, written by Catherine Ann Porter. She was a Pulitzer Prize winner in 1966. She is also the author of the novel Ship of Fools, which some of you have probably read. At the time that she did get the flu, and she at the time was a reporter for the Rocky Mountain News in Denver, Colorado. The flu for her was a near-death experience, and that is what sort of motivated her to write the novella Pale Horse, Pale Rider. Elizabeth Otka, in her essay, writes of Porter's reaction to the flu is to write a story. And so Otka states, in October of 1918, a delirious Catherine Ann Porter experienced what she termed the beatific vision. Close to death from the novel influenza virus that would kill 50 to 100 million people, Porter felt transported to a paradisal landscape, one free of the pain and fear that had overtaken her body. To the surprise of all, she survived her illness and later transformed the experience into her powerful novella, Pale Horse, Pale Rider. So now, and I just want to talk about the plot before I talk about the similarities. So the plot of Pale Horse, Pale Rider, for anyone who hasn't read it yet, the novella is about a journalist named Miranda who has a brief love affair with a soldier named Adam. He's a second lieutenant in the engineer corps. He's from another part of the United States and is in Miranda's Colorado town because he is stationed at an army training camp preparing to go off to fight in Europe. As this knowledge hovers over them that he will soon be leaving for war, he is expecting that he will be the person who dies. And this hangs like a dark cloud over their brief romance. Ironically, what ends up separating them is not his departure for the war front, but the fact that Miranda comes down with the flu and is quarantined in a hospital where he can no longer see her. I think the novella is about many things: work life for a woman reporter at a time when there were few women doing such jobs, life on the home front while a war is waging in another part of the world, and a critique of those who use the war for profit. But for today, I want to talk about the way these two works share patterns in terms of reactions, literary responses to the flu, in their case, the Spanish flu or the 1918 influenza pandemic. So one thing that's striking about both of them is the way the flu enters into the works. It's not right away, it's little by little. And in They Came Like Swallows, you can see from the page number that it's at the very beginning of the novel. It's a Sunday, and the father they've finished their family meal, they've gone to church, and now they're sitting in their wonderful family parlor with all their relatives, and the father starts reading the newspaper. I just have bits of the quote up. The quote is quite long, so I'll read a little bit of it. So his father had settled himself in his chair with the Sunday paper. From time to time, he solemnly turned the pages. When he read aloud, he expected everybody to listen. What is Spanish influenza? Is it something new? Does it come from Spain? The disease now occurring in this country and called Spanish influenza resembles a very contagious kind of cold, accompanied by fever, pains in the head, eyes, back, or other parts of the body, and a feeling of severe sickness. In most of the cases, the symptoms disappear after 3 or 4 days, the patient rapidly recovering. Some of the patients, however, develop pneumonia or inflammation of the ear or meningitis, and many of these complicated cases die. Whether this so-called Spanish influenza is identical with the epidemic of earlier years is not known. And the father keeps on reading. As I said, the quote is quite long, and the mother finally interrupts him and says, you know, there are children in the room, why don't you read a different article from the newspaper? Later in the novel, much later, around page 145, after the family's been devastated by the flu and the boys have lost their mother, Bunny, the younger son, overhears one of his relatives talking about the quote-unquote original source. By this time, it's decided that the flu is not Spanish, but German, that it was brought to this country, meaning the United States, in German submarines. And this ties in then with Pale Horse, Pale Rider. In the story Pale Horse, Pale Rider, it's a work scene where Miranda's sitting around with her other colleagues, and the only other female in the office, Townie, starts jokingly talking about sort of the misinformation. And remember, these are all reporters, these are news people, so they're kind of having a very ironic conversation about the misinformation that's spreading through the news. So from Pale Horse, Pale Rider, Miranda's colleague says, they say that it is really caused by germs brought by a German ship. And I can't see part of it, so I'm going to have to read from my script. Brought by a German ship to Boston, a camouflage ship naturally. It didn't come in under its own colors. Isn't that ridiculous? Maybe it was a submarine, said Chuck, sneaking in from the bottom of the sea in the dead of night. Now that sounds better. Yes, it does, said Townie. They always slip up somewhere in these details, and they think the germs were sprayed over the city. It started in Boston, you know, and somebody reported seeing a strange, thick, greasy-looking cloud float up out of Boston Harbor and spread slowly all over that end of town. I think it was an old woman who saw it. Should have been, said Chuck. I read it in a New York newspaper, said Townie, so it's bound to be true. And then they all chuckle. So then I want to talk about the similarity in how this flu, this foreign thing, starts invading their homes and eventually their bodies. So when They Came Like Swallows, the first person to come down with it is Bunny, the little boy. He gets it most likely from a classmate at school who was sick with some kind of virus. And Bunny kept trying to tell his mother that, you know, my classmate's been sick and the mother is busy, she's pregnant, she's getting ready to go to Decatur, Illinois to give birth to her child, and no one's listening to Bunny. And then Bunny gets sick with the flu. Eventually the mother will get it and the father will get it when they're in Decatur, Illinois at a hospital for the purposes of the mother to give birth, because there was concerns about complications with her third child. Also an uncle will get it. The only person who will die from it is the mother, and she from complications from secondary pneumonia. And this is something very interesting about the 1918 influenza pandemic, is that most people died not from the flu, but from the secondary complications. with Pale Horse, Pale Rider, it's Miranda who comes down with it first, and Adam, being the dutiful boyfriend, brief boyfriend, takes care of her until she can be taken to a hospital. One of the reasons that he has to take care of her is that there is a shortage. It takes a while for an ambulance even to come and get her because there aren't enough in the town. The town has been overrun at this point with the flu, and there are no hospital beds initially for Miranda. So while she's waiting to enter a hospital, Adam risks his own life taking care of her. So then the next thing is the way in which the Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918, factors in both of these works. And here's where it's interesting. For They Came Like Swallows, it's the beginning of Bunny's flu. For Pale Horse, Pale Rider, it's the end of Miranda's. But this day figures very importantly in both works. So in They Came Like Swallows, it's the next day, Monday, when Bunny goes to sleep, Sunday night at the end of this long detailed chapter 1 about a typical day, a typical Sunday in their life, he is not feeling well. When he wakes up in the morning on Monday, he hears bells ringing and he doesn't understand why. And so here I have the description on the screen. But instead of listening to the military terms of the armistice with Germany, Bunny went and put his head in his mother's lap, for he felt very odd inside of him. He heard her say, "James," that's the husband, "James, this child is burning up with fever." And he thought dreamily, Bunny thought dreamily that it must be so. "I'm going to be sick," he thought, grateful for the cool hand on his forehead and her nearness to him. So for Bunny, he's burning up with fever, but he's thrilled to be near his mother because he knows by this point that she's about to leave him to go to a hospital to give birth to a third child. For Miranda in Pale Horse, Pale Rider, the Armistice Day comes at the end of the story. She has been in a hallucinatory, dreamlike state unbeknownst to her for probably a month, if not longer. Eventually she does go into the hospital. And when she comes out of this crazy dreamlike existence that Catherine Ann Porter writes beautifully, she hears bells and she doesn't know what they are. And so this is the scene. Bells screamed all off key, wrangling together as they collided in midair. Horns and whistles mingled shrilly with cries of human distress. Sulfur-colored light exploded through the black window pane and flashed away in darkness. Miranda, waking from a dreamless sleep, asked without expecting an answer, "What is happening?" For there was a bustle of voices and footsteps in the corridor and a sharpness in the air. The fart clamor went on, a furious, exasperated shrinking like a mob in revolt. The nurse, Miss Tanner, says a little bit later, "Hear that? They're celebrating. It's the armistice. The war is over, my dear." So Miranda can hear people singing, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty." But for her, her body has been ravaged. Her hands are yellow, her face is unrecognizable to her when she sees herself in a mirror. And this happened to Catherine Ann Porter herself. So this leads to what Elizabeth Oetka talks about, contagion guilt. She writes that in works like They Came Like Swallows and Pale Horse, Pale Rider, there is a consequence to misreading the signs, to misunderstanding how the virus spreads. The consequence is people die. And this leads for the survivors to contagion guilt. And again, it's just kind of interesting to think about because we are right now at a time where there is a lot of debate from state to state about opening up. Some people are for it, others are not. And some people are very worried about what opening up will mean. So when They Came Like Swallows, all three men of the family feel guilt for their mother's death. And the rest of the novel, chapter 3 through the father's perspective, is dealing with what ifs. For the father, he is tormented by what if he and his wife had not traveled by train to Decatur? What if he had spent more money and put them on an express train with fewer people on the train? Would she have not caught the flu? For the eldest son, Robert, the what if is, what if he hadn't let his mother into Bunny's room when Bunny was so sick? The doctor had told the mother not to enter because she was pregnant, and she, as a devoted mother to her sick child, did everything in her power to sneak into the room. And Robert was in charge of keeping her out, and he felt he had failed. For Bunny, the what if is, what if he had never gotten sick? He lost his mother, with whom he was quite close. In Pale Horse, Pale Rider, before Miranda realized she had the flu and how serious it was, she and Adam, there are details, Catherine Ann Porter has amazing details of sort of their romance as they walk through the streets of this Colorado town, eat at restaurants, share cigarettes, and even kiss. And in one of the scenes, which is a connection, where there's a connection to the title, while Adam is taking care of Miranda before she'll be taken care of by doctors. In fact, there's a point where the doctors tell Adam to get out, that he's risking his own life. They sing this spiritual, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, done take my lover away. And Adam talks about how, he heard this spiritual, he heard Negroes in Texas singing it in an oil field. And so they sing the spiritual together. By now, Miranda knows she is quite sick, and Adam is in love with her and seems to take care of her despite her being so sick. And on the right, I just have the quote from the Bible from Revelations, where this reference comes from. So there, the four horsemen of the apocalypse are the conqueror on a white horse, war on a red horse, famine on a black horse, and death on a pale horse. And I think there might be a rock song, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, but I'm not sure. Maybe someone can let me know. So then the endings of these two works. For both works, the question at the end is, what does it mean to survive when your loved one dies? So the quote from They Came Like Swallows, first the eldest son, eventually a relative explains to him how the virus worked, and that when his mother ran into Bunny's room about Contagion, the mother came down with it when she was in Decatur, weeks later after she had been exposed to Bunny. And so Robert is freed from his, the quote says, Robert was freed from his mistake. It was evident from the way he walked. Neither Robert nor anyone else was responsible for Elizabeth's death. That's the mother. And anyway, it was what people intended to do that counted, not what came about because of anything they did. Another quote towards the end of the novel that I found really powerful was the issue of that this is not the first nor the last pandemic. What happened to him, James, the father, had happened before, and it would happen again, more than once. In Pale Horse, Pale Rider, when Miranda finally comes to, she learns that Adam actually has died, that he died in an army camp hospital of the flu, so he never even made it to the war front. And so Miranda has to deal with the fact that she has lost a man whom she loved. And there's a really, I found a quite powerful quote towards the end. Miranda wondered again at the time and trouble the living took to be helpful to the dead. But not quite dead now, she reassured herself, one foot in either world now. Soon I shall cross back and be at home again. The light will seem real, and I shall be glad when I hear that someone I know has escaped from death. I shall visit the escaped ones and help them dress and tell them how lucky they are and how lucky I am to still have them. And the final words of the novel are, no more war, no more plague, only the day's silence that follows the ceasing of the heavy guns. Noiseless houses with the shades drawn, empty streets, the dead cold light of tomorrow. Now there would be time for everything. So now I would like to get on to the Japanese work and talk about how this nonfiction work, this medical diary by this country doctor in Tochigi Ken, a little north of Tokyo, a beautiful part, a mountainous part of Japan, wonderful hiking, how I see some connections. So the English title is there. Anyone out in the audience who can read Japanese, I provided the kanji as well. The doctor is Dr. Gomibuchi Ijiro, who lived from 1885 to 1952. He published this little booklet on his own, and it's a booklet of his research. So, and the way I came across this work is in my search. The question I was asking myself as I was putting this lecture together is, you know, I'm a Japan scholar, where is the Japanese literature in my lecture? And I'm drawing a blank. I can't think of anything, like nothing is coming to mind right now, and I've contacted a few colleagues. I'm waiting to hear from them. I've just been drawing a blank of like a Japanese equivalent of Pale Horse, Pale Rider, or They Came Like Swallows. So I was looking for a work of fiction, and when I was doing my search, I came across this article by, let me just get by Edwina Palmer and Jeffrey Rice, that appears in the Bulletin of the History of Medicine, published by Johns Hopkins University, and they talk about this medical diary. And in the classes I teach, I am very keen on having my students think about literature and texts in ways beyond sort of the canonical. You know, what do we mean when we say literature? Is it only works published by an established publishing house? Is it only works that receive international prizes? Is it only something that you read on paper or bound with covers? Or can we have literature, stories, narratives that are of value, worthy of listening to, that come in different shapes and sizes? In my department a few years ago, we put on an exhibit called Textiles, text-tiles, to play with this idea of narratives being told through many different sources. And I want to do a shout out to my colleague Karen Poremsky, who I know spoke about the literature of Native American Indians. So it gets into that relationship. People have stories, but there have to be people willing to listen to those stories. And there has to be a means by which these stories are transmitted from the storyteller to the listener. And that can be a very complicated, a very problematic dynamic. Often there are economic issues, political issues, sometimes gender, sometimes race, cultural. There are a whole host of issues. And these are questions that I have my students in my classes, in my department, think about. So getting back to a country doctor's research, in Japan, the flu was known as Spain Kaze or Ryukose Kanbo, the epidemic cold. In Japan, about 470,000 people were estimated to have died between 1918 and 1920 due to the flu. So you see it's quite longer than 1919. Another 200,000 died in Taiwan and Korea, and it should be noted that during this time, Taiwan and Korea were colonies of Japan. Japan was an empire. Whole villages in Japan were wiped out. Between 1918 and 1924, more than 300 articles were published in Japanese medical journals about the treatment for the flu. Most were about the use of a state-sanctioned influenza vaccine that the government approved of. One of these articles, however, was by Dr. Gomibuchi. His solution was different. He had he had a colleague, a friend who was an ophthalmologist, who had been using diphtheria serum for, I think, like cataracts or something, some kind of eye ailment. And so he had thought that this might work for people whose symptoms he was seeing. He was initially very hesitant, and it wasn't until a parent of an 11-year-old boy who was clearly going to die, and the parents signed off and basically said, you can experiment with our son. But initially, I want to make clear, he was very hesitant about using human beings as guinea pigs with this diphtheria serum. So between December 8th, 1918 and April 14th, 1919, he administered a total of 236 injections of the serum to 124 patients. Not a single one of his 124 patients died. And I want to also add that he himself got sick, as well as members of his family, and he tested the serum on himself and every member of his family. So he concluded that effectiveness has been certain. So Palmer and Rice write about the significance of this work, that Gomibuchi's little booklet appears to be the only surviving example of a physician's detailed personal description of the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic in Japan. It is also a rare snapshot of the epidemic's impact on a rural community that suffered a high death rate until this physician began his experiments with diphtheria serum. And then it's this next quote that sort of speaks to me and the kind of research that I do, where I'm always trying to unearth the stories that risk being forgotten. So Palmer and Rice write, his tiny booklet is a contribution to the very meager literature currently available on the occurrence of the pandemic in Japan. And I just want to note that they wrote this article in 1992. So this is now like my new summer research project is to, right before this lecture, I was reading his journal, I'm thinking about it, and I want to do more work to speak to that last quote. Is in fact there meager literature available in Japan on the 1918 pandemic, or is it out there but it just hasn't been found? So some similarities with the literary text in the way the flu is depicted in his medical diary. He begins with a focus on the weather on a fall day, which is a beautiful season in Japan, especially where he is living in Tochigi-ken. It's one of my favorite places to go hiking when I'm in Japan. The flu is described as an invader. He talks about how he has read about this flu as of something of Europe, and then he's reading news reports that it's in the South Seas, and now it's in Japan, in Tokyo, and now it's getting closer and closer to his rural community. It then not only gets into his community, it actually gets into his family and into his body and the bodies of his family members. He writes, I was extremely busy going to and fro every other day between Omiya and Yamada to visit the sick and observe the situation at first hand. There was no stopping it, meaning the flu. And the doctor realizes that there are not enough resources. Again, think about some of the discussions that have been going on in this country about COVID-19 affecting rural communities and the lack of resources in rural communities. And he writes, I realized now that there were so many patients that there were not enough doctors to treat them all. In the past, there had always been enough doctors to treat the sick in this district. So Palmer and Rice do have a few caveats about his research. He used the serum only on cases that were not quote unquote hopeless. He was also administering this treatment when the virus had already started to wane in his area. In 1922, an official Japanese government report talks about the fact that the government had emphasized across all prefectures the use of masks, gargling, and inoculations with the influenza vaccine, and claimed that it was available to all during the pandemic. Yet Gomibuchi makes no reference to any of these measures. And the authors wonder if this speaks to his experience as a country doctor left to his own resources, that despite what the national government was saying about available resources, were they in fact unevenly available depending on what part of a prefecture you might be in. And just to recognize the poster, this is a poster, one of these health posters, and it says, if you take the shot, then the god, or the in this case the monster, the devil, the cold devil, will not come into your house. So one thing, and I'm pretty sure I'm getting long here, and I can't find my phone with the timer, but one thing, I won't read this whole quote, it's pretty long, but a part of the quote is important to me. Palmer and Rice ask at the end of their essay, what if this work had not been discovered? And this is something that's of interest to me when I go to libraries, especially in the summer, to do archival research. The research that I do is detective work. And a lot of the detective work is in the private hands. Very important historical documents are often in private hands. And they languish sometimes in private hands. Last summer I had a long conversation with an archivist at Stanford University about, when important famous people, personal papers are left to the responsibility of family members. In some cases they're protected, in others they're not. So these authors of this article call for care to sort of go out, they almost put a call out to colleagues, to scholars, to go out in search of other sources in terms of how the 1918 pandemic was dealt with in Japan, and to go into people's, to kind of think about people's private museums, so to speak. So I'd like to end talking about this idea of writing, and the fact this idea that we are all living archivists. So at the beginning of my talk, I talked about the act of reading, but now I would like to talk about writing. What stories can all of us tell? As Gomibuchi's example should show, even though we are not famous, we all have stories to tell about this historic event. As my literature colleague Karen Poremsky spoke about last week, for us not to be erased, rendered invisible by being part of some statistical number, we need to have our voices heard as individuals going through this experience. And I'm pretty sure I'm a little long with the lecture. I was going to end with a reading from one of my students. This is a picture of my students from my Silk Roads Honor Seminar right before spring break. This is probably one of the last times I saw any students in person. We were making plans for more of these food banquets to experience the Silk Road in Columbus, Ohio through various restaurants. But during the pandemic, when I was teaching my students online, I asked them to think about the pandemic, what reading literature means for them during this pandemic. And they sent me some responses, but I'm pretty sure I'm long now. So I'm going to end here, and I can always talk about this in the community sessions or in Q&A. So thank you very much. And then I will, oh yes, I'm long.
Thank you. That was terrific. It made me think of these pieces that I didn't know much about, and now I want to read them. And I love the idea of harnessing experiences and becoming more powerful through that harnessing. In interest of time, I'm just going to take one question. And if folks have more questions that they want to raise, please come to the Meet the Prof sessions. We have a question from an individual who is wondering, how have literary responses to these pandemics been used in narrative medicine pedagogy, or have they been?
Yeah, so that is that's a really good question, and that actually because of this medical diary that I really just discovered it. I discovered it about a week ago in my research. I'm now become very fascinated with this, and my colleague Randy Quay, of course, this is a specialty of his, is sort of medical social science. I had never thought about this in the past. This wasn't the kind of research I was doing. I was doing work on the Tokyo trials and looking at literary representations of the Tokyo trials. So this is, but discovering this diary, one thing the Palmer and Rice ask in their 1990 article is that someone should translate it. And so I'm actually thinking about, that's what I was doing before this lecture, is like, actually, I've read it, you know, kind of scanned through it, but now I want to read it very carefully for the purpose of translating. So this would be new research for me. So right now I cannot answer that question because I have never considered this question before until I found this source. And since I am in a lockdown and can't travel to Japan to do the research I was planning, I've decided I'm very intrigued by this idea of medical narratives. So stay tuned. I don't have an answer for now.
That sounds like an answer to me. We'll be excited to see what comes of it. Thank you to Dr. Sokolsky for sharing your time and knowledge with us. Thank you to the audience for joining us and asking questions. Feel free to ask questions on the Facebook group. And of course, another way to continue the conversation is the Meet the Prof sessions. Students who have registered for course credit can join us on Thursday at 4 p.m. and Blackboard Collaborate. Community members can join us at noon on Friday and Blackboard Collaborate, and RSVP links will be provided for that. If you have any questions, please contact COVID Class Coordinator at owu.edu, and we will see you again Wednesday, that's tomorrow, at 4 p.m. for Pandemics, Politics, and Pictures, Italian Art and the Black Death with Dr. Carol Newman de Veglar. Thank you all.